I've also worked for a university, and I've also worked in the private sector, primarily in the financial services industry throughout. If I had to choose some traits to kind of describe my background or my passions, I guess, I'd say I'm a little bit entrepreneurial, independent, hardworking, typical Midwestern kind of values there, and I have a streak of creativity. In spite of years working in corporate America, sometimes tough to hang on to that, but I do like to do some creative things. So, having said that, I wanted to ask you guys some questions. Bear with me here while I kind of get the rhythm down for all these different windows. I wanted to ask you, give me a good sense of kind of what your backgrounds are, because I don't know if you're like me, but when I was little, I never said, I want to be an instructional designer when I grow up. So, curious to know kind of where all of you guys come from. So I don't know, Dr. Gibson, if you can kind of help me do a go-round, but I'd be curious to hear, for those in the room, either what your current job is or your most recent job, and it's okay if it's a student.
Yeah,
It's your job.
Kind of start with Jenna and kind of work around. We have a lot of students here, but they also have some life experiences. So Jenna, we'll just kind of work around this.
Sure. I'm actually just a full-time student right now. I just graduated with my undergrad in May, so I just started grad school in the fall. So I have not had a job in instructional design yet.
All right, that's all right. I'm also trying to adjust my, if I'm looking all over here, it's because I'm trying to adjust my video screen too. So.
All right.
Hi. All right. Hi.
I'm from China. Right now I'm a student, and actually this is my second semester in IDT program, so I don't have any job experience yet. So hopefully in the future.
All right. Brand new, thank you.
I'm Darcy. Currently, I'm an administrative officer in the financial aid office here in Emporium State. I've been doing that for 3 years. Had retail management before that, and this is also my second semester in the IDT program.
Nice.
My name is Strap, and this is my third semester. In IDT, and I've not had any IDT experience. Yeah.
All right.
You like the voice. Hi.
Oops, sorry. Hold on just a second. I got to get the camera down here. Okay.
Hi, I'm Malik. Regarding my educational background, I have a bachelor degree in electrical engineering and a master degree in business administration. I worked for 7.5 years as a project manager in electricity distribution utility. And now I'm doing my second master in instructional design and technology. This is my second semester.
Okay, nice.
Hold on. There's Strap. Hold on. Okay, wait.
Me? Okay. Hi, I'm Wei. I'm from China. I had my bachelor degree from China with computer science technology. I worked 2 years as a programmer, specialty in C# and a SQL Server, some Oracle. And I earned my first master degree at Emporium State University with an MBA in ERP concentration. And right now, I'm currently earning my second master degree with IDT degree, and also I'm working as graduate assistant at a learning department. I'm not sure if it's counted as part of instructional design because I'm mainly just working on post-video production and interview, that kind of shooting. So that's pretty much me.
Okay.
All right.
Mohammed?
Hi, my name is Mohammed. I'm from Jordan. So my background was as a bachelor degree in MIS, Management Information System. I did my MBA as well back home in Jordan, collaborating with Ohio University. So I used to work like the first job for me, I worked as a teaching assistant.
Mm-hmm.
I taught like database, information system, computer skills. So after I got my master's degree, the university like promoted me to be an academic coordinator, which is high one of the highest level on management regarding to that university. That university, I work with it. It has 13 college. It's a big university in Jordan. So after I got my master's degree, because I was working in the university, and you mean the best thing in the university to be a professor. So I decided to come to America to do my PhD in business administration. So I had two friends from Jordan. They did IDT in Employee State University. They advised me to get my second master in IDT. So right now, I decided to study a second master instead of my PhD in business administration. So once I finish my IDT, I follow my friend's steps to do a second master in IDT. And after that, I'll get my PhD in business administration. Why IDT? To enhance my educational way, to use educational technology in my teaching way.
Very nice.
And Cheryl, you want to hop in? Oh, you're still muted, Cheryl.
Okay, can you hear me? Sorry. My name is Cheryl Clark, and I started the IDT program in the summer of 2012. So I'm about at the end. This semester I'm actually in 810 multimedia design, so busy on projects every week with lots of different types of software. I work for LexisNexis, which is an online database for legal and business professionals. My area of work in the company is teaching and training law school students how to find information on our product. I've got an MLS from Emporia, and increasingly our students, just like us in learning online, they want to have available learning tools 24/7. So that's why my interest in really designing training so that if I'm not there, students can pick any time of day or night to go ahead and receive training.
Very nice. Such a wide variety in your class of backgrounds. It's interesting to hear that. So some things haven't changed, I guess, since I started. Like I said, most people, we kind of joke about how we stumbled into this. And so it sounds like you guys have interesting stories as well. Thank you. That helps me. All right. So this next one you should get a kick out of. We'll do this real quick. Let's just go by show of hands. And let me change my screen so I can see everybody again. Okay, hopefully I'll be able to see this in Emporia as well. I'm curious, if I asked you these, how many of you are planning to stay local when you graduate with this degree? Got one? All right.
Just one.
Okay, how many of you are going to relocate? I know those of you who have come here from other places, but are you planning to relocate from somewhere other than where you originally were, like do a national or perhaps international job search when you're done?
Anybody? International job search or Strap and Alec? Okay, anybody else going to do Stoney? No? Okay. Mohammed?
I'll stay here.
You're going to stay here? Okay. Just a couple, Tori.
Okay. All right. A little bit later, I'm going to be asking you guys some questions about the job market or who you're competing with or other programs. It's very interesting to hear this. I haven't talked to new students in quite a while. So, all right. Thank you. All right. So when I've been in the field, we kind of have a running joke that it's really hard to explain what it is that we do. I don't know if you guys have bumped into that yet. Has your family asked you what on earth you're studying? Friends asked you? Can't see you very well.
Yes.
Yes, we got some yeses on that, yeah.
Thank you. So I've been doing this for a little while now, and the irony is that some things haven't changed. I asked my mom just before this presentation, because even when I bump into other people at conferences and on websites and blogs, I still see this as a common theme. So I kind of asked my mom, just for kicks, how she would describe this, and this is what she said. Tom is my dad, so she just kind of gives up. And I said, well, if you had to tell people something that I do, what would that be? And she says, you make programs for bankers. Well, I said, Mom, I don't work for the Fed anymore, so that's close, but what else? Here's what she says to that. Not sure exactly. And then here she says booklets with instructions. So I specialized in online learning for about 13 years when I was with the Fed, so she's close, but not quite. Have any of you guys had that experience yet, trying to explain what it is you do?
Well, actually, one of our assignments, Tori, was to have the students try and identify what it is exactly instructional designers do. And there's, the set of competencies, the IBSTA's competencies that they read through, and it's such a diverse field that everybody had a little bit of a different twist and perspective on that. But that's good. There's just a lot of diversity in the field.
So I was going to ask you, I knew from your syllabus that that was something that you were covering officially. So I don't know if you guys have thought about the so-called elevator speech. If somebody asked you out of the blue who wasn't familiar with this industry, how do you think you might describe what it is that we do in 30 seconds or less?
Anybody want to tackle that? 30 seconds or less, what do I do?
Instructional design, actual tool.
Yeah, take it, Bella. So,
Hello again. I think the main part of instructional design, they are creating instructional experiences and objectives that makes the acquiring of knowledge and skills more effective, efficient, and appealing.
Good. All right. Has anybody been asked if they're an architect or an interior designer?
Yeah.
That might, yeah. If not, that might be coming. Cheryl, I'm curious, have you gotten that question? Is your title right now instructional designer?
No, it's not. It's actually account executive, even though we design all of our own training and handouts, and we work sometimes with outside instructional designers. Sometimes it's inside with respect to an internal company unit, but being that I am kind of in an academic environment with respect to the area of our company, we do a lot of things for our department within our department. So we're kind of the jack of all trades.
Nice. Well, there's some advantages to having a title like account executive as opposed to instructional designer, but heads up to all of you, I think that is something that will come in handy, especially if you're going into a larger type organization where they might not be familiar with your title. Just brush up on it, test it out with some people, see if they get it, see what questions they have. What you're looking for is something short and sweet to explain what you do. It's not confusing, that gives you credibility. So that they'll know that you're the person to call when you need XYZ. So just something to keep in mind there. All right. So today I thought I'd just kind of walk through some of the different places I've worked and just share a little bit about what it was like, what the hiring process was like, maybe some things that I've learned, and then I have some questions for all of you. As I said, it's been a little while since I've had a chance to talk with students, so I'm curious about some things like, again, who the big programs are right now, what kind of tools you're using, just little things like that. So before I jump into this, do you guys have things in particular that would be of interest to hear? Is there something that you want to make sure that I cover for you tonight? If not, that's okay.
not yet, but it may come. So.
All right. You guys are going to be quiet.
Strap has a question. Go ahead, Strap.
Which different sectors can instruction and design be employed in?
Go ahead. Come on, with the question.
Which different sectors can an instructional designer be employed in?
Oh, okay. Good question.
Wait, Mom. We may have some more. I'm sure we will.
Okay. All right. That's a very good question. And I'll give you kind of the short answer now. I think it's, if I use the word sectors as industries, I'd say almost any of them. And we'll talk a little bit here more about my experience. I'm going to switch screens. Are you guys able to see? No, because I shared just the one application. Give me a second. I should have shared my desktop. But I'm going to show you some of the places that I've worked. I know when I started in the field, here we go. Instructional design was really more concentrated in a lot of the major cities. It's, as you know, it's a pretty specialized field. Now that more and more people are hearing about it, and there are actually a lot of people working in the industry, in our industry, without a degree. So the title has gotten out there, which is good and not so good in some respects, but you're seeing a lot more jobs pop up in other places that you wouldn't have traditionally seen. So I'd say if there's a certain type of industry that that you want to investigate, by all means look into it. There might also be opportunities to kind of get an opening in there, even if you don't see jobs right now. So anyway, that's the short answer for that one. I just did a quick Prezi here. Can I get a show of hands? How many of you are familiar with Prezi or have used it before? Oh, good. Good. Okay. And I'll just, fair warning, this is nothing fancy. I just kind of put this together. I was just kind of playing with the software. So you may see, you know, it's not, I didn't intend this to be a professional presentation. So again, this is just kind of supposed to be casual and a little bit fun. So, all right. So this first section, this is where I got my degree, Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. I heard from some of you, it sounds like you have assistantships. So for those of you who are not aware, I'm certainly happy to hear that you're taking advantage of those. I was working, Carbondale, Illinois is a fairly small town. I was working in a bank with their operations group and found from one of my colleagues that she was going back to graduate school. So I thought, well, why not? I'll look into it, and ended up kind of falling into the program. Didn't know that this existed. Was thrilled when I found it, though, because I felt like, oh, there's more people that see the world the way I see it, and just felt very logical and ordered. And so I checked into assistantships and got my degree paid for, which was wonderful. The assistantships for mine were not in the department, so if you're not already on one, just be aware that you can get all kinds of them. They don't. I had one friend who was an MBA, and she ended up managing one of the computer centers. My undergraduate degree is in communication, so I was doing some PR, newsletter writing for a couple different departments. This building down here is actually a small business incubator. I don't know if any of you heard of that kind of term or that program before. Okay. So this was a joint effort between the university and the Small Business Administration, but this whole building, it actually was a great experience for me during graduate school. But they had professionals, marketing professionals, development professionals, and their job was actually to assist small business owners. And they leased space at cost or at a discount in this building. So that building actually housed several different new businesses. And our office was right there by that front door, and that was a two-way glass. So we had the greatest time in graduate school getting to see people coming in. And we also got free use of the computer lab in there. So it was a great arrangement. In terms of, let's see, some of the things that I learned while I was there. These are some of the big things, the line versus staff, some things about software training, industry averages. Before I get into that, I'm curious to know how many of you heard of the terminology if I say a line position versus a staff position.
Line versus staff.
I know you MBAs will know this.
You're looking puzzled.
Okay.
Have you guys heard that terminology? Line versus staff? Line versus staff. Okay. That's a new one for them.
Okay. All right. So line versus staff essentially just means that if you're part of if you look at the org chart and kind of your function in the organization, a line person is somebody who's actually generating revenue for the company. So if I work for McDonald's, then I'm making hamburgers. If I'm a staff person, that means I'm not directly generating revenue. So in terms of a learning position, something that I took away from grad school in addition to the technical skills was to consider that difference. If you are a line person and generating revenue, that often can mean that you're not necessarily considered just a soft position, staff position. When it comes to layoffs, turnover, that kind of thing, that's something to be considered. Pace can be different. They also advised us to think about how high up in the organization the learning function sits. So the closer you can get to the top, the more that you can actually get done. So I think I have a question a little bit later on, but how many of you have heard of, if I say the acronym HPT, has anybody heard of that?
Yep.
Human performance technology.
Fantastic. Okay. Now, is that part of the program at Emporia, or where did you hear that?
In my first class last semester.
Wonderful. Okay.
We covered this class too as well.
Wonderful. Okay. So part of the reason that positioning is important is because if you want to use an HPT type of approach, you're going to be much better suited to be able to do that. The higher you are up in the organization, and the more closely aligned and plugged in you are to those line positions. So that was something important that we took away, again, knowing that we wanted to take an HPT kind of approach. Some other kind of big things in terms of getting us ready for the job world, I guess. I just remembered about the software training, and I know these sound like random facts. I didn't necessarily want to go into all the other technical details with you, but I thought these might be some things that might be helpful. As an industry, when you were talking about which sectors an ID can be employed in, software training, I think, is one that can be a tough one to work in, primarily because a lot of times your job is to create training for something that doesn't yet exist. They want learning to be produced at the same time and have it be released at the same time as that new product. So very fast-paced information that's changing a lot. Some people thrive on that, but just something to be aware of. If you're working on creating learning for something that exists, software training, it's a whole different ballgame. So Cheryl, I don't know if you deal with that at all when you're having to work with the LexisNexis, maybe upgrades or other features. Do you find that ever to be an issue?
Yes, of course, we're lucky that we do get special certified IDs in order to create the learning so the second that it's released. But still, even in a certified environment, you never exactly know what's going to happen on the end. You're right about that.
Mm-hmm. So in situations like that, it's very important to know going in. It's not going to be neat and tidy. You definitely have to be plugged in with the line folks. You got to be in the right environments in terms of the testing and definitely those things. So just something to be aware of too. That was important to me as we talked about when we neared graduation, we talked about internship opportunities. So if that appeals to you, I mean, the more technology background that you have, honestly, I think the more marketable that you probably are. And the more you're able to apply some of your skills to other positions that aren't necessarily just instructional. So it's a fantastic opportunity, but the constraints and the pressures are just a little bit different. So industry averages are out there on the internet. I'd encourage you to look those up. It's just something as a new person, if you're going to an environment that doesn't have a lot of instructional designers already, it's going to be very helpful for you to kind of manage some of your workflow and the expectations. So that was very helpful to me. Job hunting at conferences. This picture is actually because before we graduated, there were probably 4 of us that went to an ISPI conference in California. It was hosted at Disneyland, and did job hunting there and had a lot of interviews on the spot, and were able to do some follow-up phone calls and then some in person. But it was very valuable, very money definitely well spent. So are you involved with ISPI as a student or other organizations? Who's heard of ISPI?
That's not one we come into much contact with. Most of our students here are involved in AECT, the Association for Educational Communications and Technology.
Mm-hmm.
Any others that I'm missing, guys, that you may be involved in? That's kind of a big one for us.
What about eLearning Guild?
I am personally, but that's not something that the students typically intersect with very much.
All right. So I would just encourage all of you to kind of check out those different organizations. If you're going to join them, now's the time, because the student fee to join most of these is much less expensive, and you can tap into, I don't know what it's like now, I haven't checked it recently, but when you're a student and you're looking to search for jobs, going through those associations is a great way to do it. So again, I would shop around for those different ones and check out your opportunities. So out of curiosity, what other instructional design programs do you bump into if you're going to conferences or you're job hunting? Are there others? I know when I was in graduate school, Indiana University was a big one. San Diego State was a big one. That's where Allison Rossett was. Are you guys aware of what other programs are out there who you might be competing with?
Yeah, Indiana, of course, Molina is there. You mentioned Allison Rossett in San Diego. Utah State University, David Merrill.
Yeah.
Florida State produces a ton of different people. That's where Dick and Carey came out of, and Gagne came out of that area. I'm trying to think. Are others that I'm missing, guys? Bob, you're thinking. Those are some of the big ones. Ohio State is a big one as well. Our students actually compete in a national competition sponsored by a company called Pacificor. And they have a national instructional design competition each year where we compete against other schools. And the interesting thing about that is we're just a master's school. I say just a master's school. We don't have a terminal degree. Our students typically win that contest each year against PhD programs.
Wonderful.
So our program does quite well on the national stage when it comes to things. So, and we also have quite a bit of exposure with international universities. There's some of our faculty from South Korea and other locations. So we also involve ourselves with some international universities. Beijing Normal is one that we involve ourselves with, places like that.
Wonderful. That will definitely work to your advantage. In a second, we'll talk about my first job, but I think my hiring experience was very different going into that because of them being familiar with my graduate program. So it's really good that you have your name out there, that you're doing those competitions, and to the extent that you can be meeting other people or getting familiar with those other programs, especially if you go somewhere to a large organization, I think it's going to be helpful. It's just good to network. It's good to know who your peer groups are. So in any case, so I heard, Cheryl, I think you mentioned something about your final project. I'm curious to know what you all do there, what the requirements are.
Actually, I will be tackling that in the fall semester of 2015. Now I'm just in multimedia design, which is 810, and lots of different projects all throughout the semester. A lot of, let's see, the first project that we had to do was recording a screen and teaching or training somebody on a piece of software. So that's an example. We've also had some sound editing projects and some work with Photoshop thus far.
Okay, cool. So, Dr. Gibson, I don't know, can you share a little bit about what the final requirements are with the final project?
Yeah, what they have to do, all students are required to complete a final project, a capstone project, which is showcased at an event, biannual event, once in the fall and once in the spring. And typically all of the courses that they take, including this one, culminate in this project. And so actually students will take the project from this class and usually spin that into their final project as well. But it's usually working with some sort of a school or a company or an organization to design a learning project or a learning outcome. It could be any variety of things. I've seen videos, I've seen multimedia projects, and then they have to showcase that to, basically it's an open invite for the university to come see it and talk about it.
And part of the reason I'm asking is because I think the other thing that's important as you come out of your program, and I'm certain that your program assists with this, but is to create some kind of a portfolio so that you have some working examples. So again, that familiarity with your program, knowing kind of what the other peer groups are in the industry right now, and then creating some of those examples are very important. If any of you need, I'll put in a little plug here. projects where you need real clients, please contact me. I think we have some interesting things that might be, we could make small enough to be manageable for a student project. So if you're interested in that, please let me know. My final project, when I came out of the program, we had to, as a group, our instructors chose something that our class previously had no exposure to. Classes right before mine did things like teach how to repair a helicopter. Another class had to teach how to grind prescription lenses for eyeglasses. And then my class got to teach how to do weaving with a giant loom. Very exciting. But the interesting thing about that was that not only did they pick topics that you had no exposure to, they would bring in a subject matter expert to demonstrate. I assume you guys use SME as the terminology, or do you use a different term?
No, that's what we use.
Okay, great. So you had one shot. This was trial by fire for us. You had one shot. You knew it was coming. They gave you the topic. You could research the heck out of it. You needed to bring in your questions. But that subject matter expert would come in one time only. You could record it, whatever you needed to do. And then I think if there was a critical mass of questions from the group, they might invite them to come later. But after that, it was pretty much it. And then you had to create instruction based on that, and that was your final grade. In addition to that, each class kind of produced something, and we put that as our requirement for graduation that had to go into a portfolio. So that's kind of what it was in my class. But again, I would encourage you to hang on to some of those examples if you feel like they would help an employer potentially know what you're capable of doing.
Tori?
Yes, sir.
One of the things that the chair of the department has started doing fairly recently is that we solicit various businesses and organizations who have a specific project, just like what you mentioned, and then we pair those students with similar interest areas or backgrounds to those clients. So there's actually a real-world application to satisfy a real-world problem. So up until that point in time, the problem sets could be fictitious, but now they actually satisfy an actual learning outcome, and there are objectives that are mapped to those and competencies that are mapped to those projects. So we're now in the second semester of doing those types of things. So these students will be exposed to that model.
That's perfect. Perfect. Good to know. All right. So just again, with show of hands, how many of you have heard of Arthur Andersen before as the company?
It's a large accounting company, huge accounting company. But didn't they have some legal problems a few years ago?
Yep, and that's why I was asking. They're in the accounting industry now. There's 4 big accounting firms. They're huge, multinational, hundreds of thousands of employees. At the time I entered the learning industry, there were the big 6, and Arthur Andersen was one of them. They were based in Chicago, Illinois. So coming from Southern Illinois, it was a perfect fit. I wanted to go to Chicago, and that was my first job. Arthur Andersen at the time was kind of known as a mecca for IDs because there were literally thousands of learning professionals in St. Charles, Illinois, where we were based. I was so excited to be able to go there that I actually kind of turned down another job offer midstream because I just felt like with all the things that I would get to learn, there was just no way to compete with that. So it was a fantastic opportunity. And yeah, I was joking about whether you'd heard about them because of some of the things that happened. But that was the biggest, that group were, at least in the learning environment, the biggest group of hardworking professionals. You'll see on my slide here that type A overachievers, hardworking, just so many cool, creative things, dedicated folks. So it was a great experience. To get the job there, we didn't have to take any kind of test per se. There were about 2 rounds of interviews. The first one, as I said, was in California at a conference, and then the second one we actually went on site and met everybody on the team. I knew at the time, I remember I brought in my portfolio. They had a professional development manager, so the person I was going to report to did that part of the interview, and I remember distinctly at one point being ready to tell her about all these things that I had done, and she had my portfolio in front of her, and she quietly closed it, and she said, we're convinced that you know how to do this job, and at this point we're wondering about the fit. So I guess I want to let you know too that if you do your homework, you want to get to that point so that you're able to kind of talk about your fit with the organization. So if I say fit, it just means basically the culture, that if your work style is going to fit with theirs, if that's an environment where you'll thrive. So that's what the interviews were like there. The client services group, I started as line. Again, that was a new team that was created to sell learning services directly to the clients. I worked there, and then for the last little bit of my time with Arthur Andersen, I moved into the business consulting education group. So that was an internal or a staff position supporting other Arthur Andersen employees. So Arthur Andersen was a giant accounting firm. They also did audit, business consulting, all kinds of different things, but primarily financial service. So those that were in the business consulting practice, each of the different practice areas had their own dedicated learning group. So it was set up with matrix teams. So that's another term some of you may have heard of, your MBAs, project manager. Who knows what a matrix team is?
No, the matrix team.
All right.
Matrix team.
Matrix team.
Matrix. Where's the term matrix? Oh, wow. Matrix, like like a grid type of thing. Matrix team. You heard of that?
And it's not the cool Keanu Reeves kind of matrix.
Sorry, I had us on mute there. Why don't you go ahead and fill us in on your definition?
Okay, no problem. And please, I'm just kind of asking these to get a feel, maybe to expose you to some other terms. Different organizations may use different terms, but even if you don't know the words exactly, it's good to be familiar with the concepts so that you can kind of get a feel for what you do and don't like, or how things work as you get exposed to these other environments. So matrix teams basically are, if you think about how a matrix looks, basically it means that you're reporting to more than one person. So you have project teams that are assembled and then disband depending on the life of the project. So if you have 3 or 4 different projects going, you may have 3 or 4 different managers, one for each of those projects. At the same time, we had a dedicated professional development manager. And the reason I point that out is because I think that's somewhat unique. You might have, in some organizations, a functional manager. So depending on where learning exists in the organization, somebody else who does what you do or knows the technical background, who manages all the instructional designers. This was nice and unique because in your day-to-day work, you're going to be getting feedback based on these teams. But I don't know that I've worked somewhere else yet. Here at Keiko Ison, they have something a little bit similar, but they had a dedicated manager who does what we did, who had the instructional design background, but their full job was to kind of groom people and help you to continue to develop your skills, not just technically, but in terms of all the soft skills and job environment. And so that was such a valuable piece of the experience for me. And I'm still in touch with my old PDM. So she's become a mentor. So again, developing these long-term relationships and that networking, it's really, really important. So anyway, if you get the opportunity to, if you find environments that do that, definitely check into them because it's unusual from what I've found these days.
Tori?
Uh-huh.
The matrix format is very common in project management,
yes.
As you probably know as well.
Yes, and that, I'm glad you brought that up. I know at least one of you in the room talked about kind of that project management background, and I'm sure Dr. Gibson, you've shared this with the students as well, but I think that's another area where there's kind of a natural fit between what we do and another industry. And to the extent that you can kind of broaden your skills and develop additional skill sets, I think it's a win-win. So it gives you a little more latitude in your day-to-day work, but it also helps make you a little more marketable. So project management is something that I did a lot, especially at the Fed. That was not always my title. I might have been doing that, but there's a lot of times where you're leading, especially when I was with the Fed, leading large cross-functional teams and creating milestones and work plans and just staying on top of things. Those are all project management type activities. So something to kind of file away and think about as you get your feet wet in the industry. It might be kind of your next challenge and something that'll just help you keep your skills sharp. Another thing that was nice about this environment that, something that you might consider as you start to shop in other organizations, different roles on different projects, meaning that I could be on a team where I'm the lead instructional designer, but out of those 3 or 4 or 5 projects to which I'm assigned, there might be some overlap on the projects and the people who are assigned. So for one, I'm a project lead, and Rebecca was one of my supports. And in this organization, the projects were big enough that we would have maybe 3 or 4 different instructional designers working on it, as well as a lead. So as I said, if Rebecca is my example, she would have been my support. Well, on another project, she would be the lead and I'd be her support. And the great thing about that, there are many things that were wonderful about this environment that help kind of foster this knowledge sharing and continuous improvement mentality. But I think that was one thing that really made it easier to learn, because you were leading projects at the same time that you were supporting people, so that it kind of helped give you that immediate feedback about how it feels to, if you have somebody who's just kind of learning the new skills about how to lead the work, they're not always going to be perfect. Communication won't always be perfect. Sometimes you just don't know what you don't know. And so you might do things that cause somebody to have to work extra hours and you have no idea. And being able to have different roles on different projects with these same teams really kind of keeps it fresh and keeps you sensitized and helps keep the dialogue going, because you're kind of in the trenches together in different roles. So if you see that again, I think that's another great situation to look for. So they had a great, strong culture here. This little picture is the famous, at least for inside, Arthur Andersen famous double doors. They actually had those at the Learning Campus there in St. Charles. And those were the first. They actually took down the doors from the building from the first Arthur Andersen office, and it symbolized kind of the one-firmedness. And so that no matter where you walk into an Arthur Andersen location, the idea was that you would get the same level of service, and it was the same type of culture. So their campus, their learning campus, was an old, was it an old university, I think, that they purchased? And so when you went to training there, you actually lived in a dorm. They had a cafeteria on site. They had entertainment on site. And so then it was almost like a full immersion. So they were able to help build that culture very well. They had all kinds of, when I said thousands of people working there, specialized functions, they had full-time researchers, and I'm talking about instructional, learning assessments and all kinds of data mining, anything you could think of. They had full-time OD people, organizational development. They had translators. They had logistics people. They had technology people, everything but the kitchen sink. So that was fantastic, very exciting. But at the same time, when I moved into business consulting education, one of my managers just decided that she liked learning, she liked doing HTML. So she just kind of picked it up on her own and she did it. And so part of the environment there, and I'm pointing this out so that these are things that you can kind of be sensitized to and maybe look for. So it's kind of like dating, I guess. You start to hear some of the traits, good and bad, and start to learn about things that you would or wouldn't like to do. And so that you can kind of just be thinking about that. Again, you get exposed to other environments. But in this case, she just decided she wanted to dabble in that. And so we started doing some online projects on our own, and there was certainly a wealth of individuals there to assist us or to delegate, but we were able to dive in as much or as little as we wanted. So something to do there. Also be aware, some of these larger organizations, you may hear things about they're great to work for or they're not great to work for, or you have alumni from your program who've worked there, those kinds of things. Bear in mind, the experience can be different from unit to unit within the same organization. So for better or worse, just something to keep in mind. In this case, the partners were, again, I'm going to say the line versus staff. They came from the line, often added to their learning skills, but not all the time. And so some of the larger groups would use instructional designers basically as the development. So somebody else would do the design, they'd send it down, and you would build it, which can be great. But if you come out of graduate school and you have great design ideas, then sometimes you might be itching to do that. So if you're in a group like that, it might take you 5 years to get to the point where you're actually able to design something. Other groups were, some of them not quite as huge as that particular one. You're in there and able to do some design work right off the bat. And again, different roles on different projects. So if you can find that kind of arrangement, I'd strongly encourage you to do that. Part of the reason I'm talking so much about this culture is because In my experience, I saw there are a couple different paths you could take. I personally chose the path of going to a place where there were a lot of people there who knew far more than I did, but were in the same field. And so I kind of soaked it all in, almost like a second round of university. I had peers that went there, and again, that other job that I was interested in, was looking at, would have been a smaller organization. Where I went, it was a subsidiary of Rockwell International, so they're the ones that were working on the space stations. This would have been a manufacturing position. My life would have been very different. I think it was in Milwaukee, and you worked just off the factory floor, would have been doing learning for, I believe, 3 different types of related systems. So could be something that you could do and learn to do very, very, very well before you get thrown into a larger environment or a more chaotic, and they are a very big company, but just difference in variety and how fast and how deep you go in your skill set right off the bat. So I had peers coming to Anderson that started that and then went to Anderson, and both paths, there's no difference necessarily in the level of success. I think it's just something you might want to think about in terms of your preferences and challenges. There are pros and cons to almost any position, and it's just something to think about. Do you want to be a specialist and kind of start and be able to be one of a few and dig deep, or do you want to go somewhere really big and be exposed to lots of different things? So food for thought there. All right.
Sorry.
Yes?
I was just going to volunteer that one of my co-students in my master's program, actually, this would have been in the late 80s, she went to work for Arthur Anderson, probably through the same program that you did. So I think she worked there for a year or 2 and then went to work for United Airlines, but as an instructional designer. But so yeah. I'm pretty familiar with that. Was a really, really big program at one time.
Yes, huge. And that's the other thing too, that again, going to a large organization like that, having some of that brand recognition and that exposure, it was different in the learning world than it was if you go in to one of these, the big 4 now, as a line person, as an accountant. Some of those, it's a lot of work, a lot of hard work, a lot of hours when you first start. But if you can make it through that promotion, that first promotion to be a senior, then it really helps with your credibility and your long-term job hunting. So some other things that helped me while I was there, they did a pilot for teleworking, things like that, and then instructional technology. Honestly, I was fresh out of school. I was excited. I didn't think much about it, but things like that actually turned out to really help me later in my career. So I guess I'd also encourage you to be open to new experiences. You never know what's going to be valuable in the next job ahead of you, or even 2 jobs ahead of that. So look for things that are new and different, and think about ways that they can kind of help broaden your skill sets. So what kind of tools, when I was talking about the technology, I just briefly mentioned HTML. We were using cascading style sheets, those kinds of things. I think Dreamweaver way back then. What kind of tools are you guys using? If you could just kind of share with me. Those are not all the tools we use now, but I'm just giving you as examples from a long time ago.
We still use Dreamweaver most of the time for the web design. And I think in multimedia, and I have not taken that class yet, but some of my classmates told me that they've been using Adobe Premiere Pro and some of After Effects.
And what was the other one?
After Effects.
Cool.
So After Effects, Dreamweaver,
Photoshop,
Premiere, Photoshop, so the typical Adobe suite. Has anybody here dabbled with HTML5 yet? Class HTML5? That's coming. So if you have an opportunity to take a class in HTML5 or put your hands on some materials, I would encourage that. Because Flash is kind of dying. A lot of the browsers are going to cease support for Flash. So maybe Tori has some thoughts about that. Any other sort of multimedia applications? Are you using the standard sorts of things like the Camtasia Studio?
Camtasia.
Okay. Jenna, have you used anything? Okay. So a lot of standard software packages, Tori. We don't do a lot of custom programming. We offered a class in app development here about 2 years ago. I'm not sure that we've offered it since, but we did a class in Xcode and Objective-C for iOS application development, but not a ton of programming.
All right. And part of what I learned, even from working with programmers and other like web designers, I think my personal opinion is that the technology industry moves so fast and it's so broad that even somebody that you meet who has deep technology skills probably hasn't heard of all the programs. So it's just kind of a matter of learning enough to be dangerous, being able to scope things well. So if you're coming in and recommending an instructional solution, have some idea about what's possible. And here I don't have dedicated programmers to work with. When I was with the Fed, we did have a team, but they would basically tell us anything is possible. So, but knowing kind of what the tools were, we let you know kind of what the easiest way might have been or what the big gotchas were. So to the extent that you can kind of get familiar with the difference between a Captivate and a Camtasia and kind of doing things on your own, or asking for, some of these other things, animation or things that are more heavy-duty code pieces, it's going to help you. So if you get somewhere and you don't have dedicated programmers or web designers, I'd say work real hard to become friends with somebody in your IT department and find out who might be kind of interested in it. So who can be your kind of go-to question, or see if go-to person for questions or ideas, or even resources if you want to pilot some things. So don't worry if you're not doing everything. It changes anyway, but at least know enough to kind of know what's going on and how to scope projects appropriately. I think the other piece is know enough tools, at least, that you could probably be able to do something on your own, or at least manage a team to be able to do it on your own. So if you can be self-sufficient and you can scope broader work, I think that those are the pieces that you need.
Hey, Tori, you mentioned something I think is important. We've mentioned it in class, and that is more of the second tier, I'll call them, software products like Adobe Captivate and Articulate Storyline, those types of things. There's a lot of those types of products. I'm not sure if you're real familiar with those, but it's more of the interactive sort of capabilities.
And I have Camtasia open right here. That's something we're working on here. So when I was with the Fed, we had, as I said, a separate technology group, and then we had the instructional technology designers. And they were doing everything from creating apps to custom courses. And then we also use those kind of other tools, those quick tools as well. So I think good design is good design. You can apply a good design to a number of different delivery methods and still get effective results. But I think part of the game is figuring out which tool will suit the needs the best. And so I think it's always wise to be able to think about things like the Captivate and Camtasias, as well as some of the heavier options. So, all right. So, whoops. All right. So, can I get some feedback? Is this kind of information helpful? Is there something that would be any type of this? So again, I'm talking about kind of what the hiring process was, what it was like to be there, some things that I learned. Are those roughly the kind of areas that are helpful to hear about these positions? Is there something else you're different? All right.
Hey, Tori, so tell us a little bit about the portfolio process. That these students are going to have to put together a professional portfolio. What did that look like in your instance? Was that a digital portfolio, or just examples on a workboard, or what was that exactly?
I'm going to date myself, but it was not digital at the time, but it was a matter of pulling together the key pieces of all of our classes. And so in my program, we kind of had an instructional design model. It looked very similar to the one from Indiana, which is probably because of our instructors and our chair. That's where they came from. So the course deliverables typically mirrored most of that process. So my portfolio had the model in the front so that I could talk with an employer, especially if it was someone who knew instructional design, and show them kind of what my background or context was. And then that kind of mapped with some of the big pieces that were in my portfolio. And so I think the key piece, and you mentioned it, Dr. Gibson, is to try and tie that to the real world. So if you have something in there like a job task analysis or those kinds of things, it's helpful if you have one that they can flip through and see an immediate value to. So even a job task analysis, if it's formatted in a way that's helpful, that's going to alone help somebody be able to do their job better than to try and perhaps, if it's a very complex subject, try and figure it out on their own. So depending on how well you do the task analysis, I should say. But things like that, I think sometimes half of the value is how we present content, and the other half is how we teach it. And so think about that in your portfolio. And if you have to recreate some things or reformat them to be able to show the value, then that's very much worth it, because you want to have a conversation with a company and you want to be able to say, here's how I can help you. They're not going to be impressed with the jargon that you know or the number of theories or which theory you're using necessarily, but what they want to know is that because of what's in your head and because of the experience that you've had, you're going to be able to get their people to learn something faster and with less error than they would have if you weren't helping them. So at the end of the day, I think a lot of professionals can relate to what we do. It's sometimes just common sense, but organizations can't always afford to hire somebody to work full-time in such a specialized area. And so people can learn it by preference, and a lot of times just hit and miss. And over time, they start to learn kind of what works and doesn't. But the advantage of having instructional designers is that you can come in theoretically and you can tell them the very first time, here's what I'd recommend and here's why. Here's what the research says, here's how adults learn, and this is going to work faster the first time. So that's something to keep in mind as you build your portfolios. Does that help?
It does. Tori, do you do any sort of cost analysis in terms of let's say, for example, you're rolling out some training and you don't have instructional designers on hand to help to develop that content. Are you familiar with the companies? Do they actually do an analysis of what the impact is to the company before an instructional designer or an instructional design process is introduced, and then subsequently following the introduction of the learning event, what the cost savings were to the company, and taking into account the salary for the instructional designer, all the time and effort?
Yeah, so the great ROI debate,
Right.
everyone. Yeah, so I assume your students are familiar. Have you gone through assessments and Kirkpatrick and all that good stuff?
We are going through, right, so we're going through some of that now. They're getting a little bit of a smidgen of Kirkpatrick.
Okay.
Some of the other sorts of things. We're going to be getting into some of the ROI pretty quick.
Yeah. So I can remember, again, in my program, Sharon Schrock, Bill Coscarelli, but Sharon Schrock in particular, her specialization area was assessments and measurement. And so even back then, I think was perhaps when some of this language was just starting to emerge in the industry. But again, she had said back then, be careful what you wish for. If you go in and start to measure, for those of you who might not have heard the terminology, ROI is return on investment. And basically what you're looking for, if you're thinking about assessments, the lowest level is what we call the smile sheets. So if you send somebody a survey or give them a form right after they take the class, find out if they liked it. Was the room temperature okay? Was the PowerPoint working appropriately? Basically just how they liked it. May or may not tell you anything about what they actually learned, but it's just self-reporting, and it has a place. The next level up would be having them take some kind of a test based on the information. So you might have a pre-test and a post-test. So that gets you a little closer to finding out if they learned, what the learning gains were, and you're testing just the content that's in the class. Level 3 is what's on the job. So if you can create a simulation, or if you can get feedback from an supervisor, and find out how they're doing on the job, that's kind of the next level. So it takes it out of the classroom to see what they really learned. And the highest level is this return on investment. Companies can be very interested in that because obviously you want to, it costs time and money to build learning. And again, that's part of the reason that it's important to think about an organization you go into where you're going to be positioned, because in today's economy, don't kid yourself, nobody's necessarily guaranteed a job permanently. So these are things to think about. You may get questions about how long it took you to do something, the value that it was adding. Are you costing my company money, or are you saving my company money? And you need to be prepared to have some kind of answer to that. So having set that up, part of the reason my professor even back then said be careful is because from a learning perspective, it can be very difficult to isolate all the factors that feed into a return on investment. So in other words, I can launch a learning program, but there might be things that are beyond my control that are going to influence whether it's successful. So if I don't know, if I teach some people shortcuts on their keyboard, and maybe they're help desk employees, and they get back to their job, and in the classroom I have tested them and their response time is half the time it took them for those who don't go through that course, those kinds of things. I can show those metrics. Again, there's a cost to obtaining those metrics, but then they go back to the job and there's a different keyboard. I really need to know that, or I'm going to fail every time. So you can be collecting data. There could be other things, that just that's fairly closely related. That's one you might actually have a chance to find out about, but there are lots of other things that factor into that. It's just kind of can be a squishy number. So I think the industry is more moving towards now, don't measure ROI unless you have to. I do think, having said that though, it is important and valuable and critical that you do think about cost benefit just on a common sense level. So if you have something that you're doing that's going to, think about the quickest, most efficient way to get it done and still be effective, because you're still going to have to justify the time that you spent and the results that you get. So what I've seen have been more like when you substitute a classroom event for something online. So in the Fed, that's a national organization. You have people flying across the country to go to these classes. When you create online learning, you at least know that you can weigh the elimination of those travel costs against the time it took you and the internal cost to build that course. So what I've seen has been more like that, a little bit looser, but just kind of common sense cost benefit, and less so from the ROI. So I don't know if that helps.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Sure. So I don't know, do you normally take a break about halfway through? If so, was this a good time? Do we want to take a 5 or 10 minute quick break, or keep going, or how do you want to do this?
Yeah, let's take a 5-minute break. Is that okay?
All right.
So come back about 5:15 or so?
Sounds good to me.
Okay.
All right.
I want to test something, Tori. I'm not sure if this mute is working okay. I'm going to put you on mute. I'm going to try and talk, and just let me know if you still can hear me, okay?
Okay.
Can you hear me when I talk right now?
I can.
Okay, so this mute isn't working. That's okay. That's all right. We'll live with it.
All right. And so far, actually, it's been helpful. I don't mind at all. But again, I prefer this to feel more like a dialogue. So.
Okay, cool. All right. 5 minutes. Get yourself something to drink. Then come back about 5:15.
What other questions are you gonna ask?
What?
How many questions are you
Oh, we need to keep going.
More questions around mine. I'm not sure. Thought if she could give me some. Just staying.
Which is that's what we're looking at. Okay.
Yeah. Will you please look at my PowerPoint?
Did you say?
I don't know.
Oh, you want to do it right now?
I mean, we can do that after class.
Yeah, let's look at that class.
Because when she was presenting, I had to kind of try to listen to what she's saying, but at the same time, I had some questions. We've been studying all kinds of different models. If we do SWOT analysis, they all have different strengths and weaknesses and potential. So I was trying to
That's
see that
exactly what I was trying to say.
what kind of model would be better if it would want
We sent an
a
email
large
to
number of
everybody.
employees. Since she's been working for Anderson, which I did a little research that they had roughly 28,000 employees in the USA. So if they want to
When you told me
pursue
last time that we can get the old team,
a training for the
I already told her
employee,
that.
whole company
she
employee,
was fine.
because they all have
But if you
different
tell her right
responsibilities. different levels, how the sheep to motivate them. Take the training. But that's kind of some ideas the person come on my mind, because I think it'll be hard. I don't know really which model the sheep prefer. I'm sure that
Anyway, you can do that little.
I'm sure that they probably need the comprehensive model, but I still want to see what kind of insight I can get.
Sure. Yeah, that's great.
Thanks.
Yeah, she's very strict, you know.
Actually, I have
If you can tell her, what she's worried about is
fun.
if it doesn't arrive on time, you know, because of many things, weather, you know, so many things. But if you're gonna pay for 2 days shipping, 2 days shipping is how much is 2 days shipping? Another $20,000. Yeah, tell her you can maybe you can pay for the extra shipping. And tell her she'll do it. Because even the boy from Morocco, Abdurrahim, he wants to make some Moroccan.
Okay.
But we couldn't get his one that he wants. Special kind. He has Amazon buys it from a dealer in Morocco. It's gonna take at least 2 weeks. What are you gonna do if she bought that other one? Are you still gonna use it again? A normal one?
Don't have don't have any snacks.
I have an orange.
We haven't tried, maybe. Yes.
Are you going?
Yeah. She's outside the whole time. She's coughing, so that's why.
That's good. I didn't think you were out. If I had some cough drops, I would give them to you. I don't have any throat. Throat. You want some? I've got some hot tea.
I have some Chinese medicines for
Oh,
coughing.
okay.
Maybe it will work for her.
I need some too.
Yeah, she is. That's why she's been waiting outside for an hour.
Oh, I wasn't sure. That's okay. Okay, Tori, I think we're just about back. Darcy's still probably out, but she'll be back in a second. But I thought I would just give you a little bit of background as to where we are and in the instructional design cycle. The first module, the students are actually learning about some of the learning theories, some of the basic things that you would typically learn in an instructional design program. And then this last module we've been working at a variety of instructional design models. So we'll start to introduce them to some of those. So we've been looking at, for instance, Of course, the ADDIE, rapid prototyping, the KIMP model, Gagne. One of them that you may or may not be familiar with, that I'm kind of excited about, is called the SAM model, the Successive Approximations Model, which is based out of there's a company that actually developed that model. It's a big instructional design company out of Milwaukee. I'm trying to think, it's the gradual release responsibility model, just a variety of them. So we're primarily, we're pretty ADDIE focused here, but I'm trying to sort of introduce them to some other ones they're likely to come into contact with in a variety of areas. And rapid prototyping is certainly one of them. And in certain contexts, the SAM model is likely one they're going to come into contact with as well. KIMP, probably not as much with that particular one. But what are your students had a question about what is your preferred model for instructional design?
So I think when I started, it was definitely Gagne was the go-to, and that's definitely one that they used in the Fed, although we peppered in other models with that as well. What I found is that a lot of the models kind of overlap each other. If you look at the core, even in Gagne, I think it steps 4, 5, and 6. So that's where you present the instruction and then you provide practice and feedback. So that's really the heart of any good instructional experience regardless. So I think what I feel like I learned was to be able to not worry as much about the model and worry more about what you feel like is going to meet your needs. So pick one. I wouldn't necessarily stress about whether you have the right one. If you do want to go that route again, I think Gagne is as good as any of them. But just see if it's going to get you results. And I think the important part is that you have something that helps you work through it in a systematic way, so that you are dotting your I's, crossing your T's as you need to, and you get something on the back end that's going to directly relate to what you started with on the front end. So that's what I say about those. I think as far as ADDIE goes, that's a very broad general model, depending on what you put inside of the steps. So the model that I used in graduate school was a version of ADDIE, but there were enough micro steps within it, and it was kind of set up like a flow chart. It was very helpful as well. So we used Bloom's taxonomy, if you guys been introduced to that one.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So use different models for different things. I know Agile is something in the IT world that they're starting to adapt to the learning learning methodologies as well. So again, I think a lot of them change. Like I said, Gagne is kind of our go-to. It's pretty stable, pretty well founded. But I guess that's kind of my take on them.
So it's important that she picked out a really important term. I've mentioned it before, but that's agile, which is, you hear that term used in project management quite a bit, but you also use that term in instructional design quite a bit as well. So it's the ability to create a learning event or a learning unit that's not so rigid that you can't adapt and flex it to whatever the need might be. So agility is really get to be a key word that you can take and fix or tweak something really quickly on the fly if something is not working. You don't invest heavily in the outcome of a product only to find out that it didn't work well, so that you can circle back and make adaptations to it very quickly. So that agile sort of development cycle and sequence is very important. Wait, did you have a couple of questions that you want to ask, Tori?
Yeah.
Which one closer to the microphone?
Okay. Hey, Tori. I just had a few questions come on my mind, and when you were telling us you used to work for Anderson, which is the giant accounting company. So I did a little research online. It says it used to have about 28,000 employees in the US. So I was wondering, as an instructional designer, if you were asked to design or launch a big online training for the employee of the whole company, what kind of model would you prefer and why?
Okay, that's a big question. So when we're at Anderson, so if you're thinking about a project on that scale, I think the first thing to realize is to take a step back and realize you're not going to be doing that kind of work alone. So you'll be working with a team. And I think with Anderson, they had their own kind of system set up. They had a big binder called, I think, Method E, and it was like this thick. And they decided, again, you have these overachievers who are very detail oriented, and so they had a very thorough design. And I'm laughing because once you go that far and you get it on paper, then you realize sometimes you can't do something that robust for every single project. And the bigger and more detailed it gets, sometimes the harder it is to apply or to manage. So I think at the end of the day, it would probably depend on what type of learning that you need to roll out, what the timelines are, where the people are located. You'd have to make some common sense decisions first. Do you want them all together? Are you going to roll it out in phases? Those kinds of things that you scope. And again, my background and my bias is that I think good learning is good learning. So you can come up with a design that you can roll out in lots of different ways and it will be successful. You have to adapt it for different delivery, but I could teach you perhaps how to grow flowers. There might be a way that you can do that will help teach somebody, and you can have a portion of that that's in video. You can have a portion of that that's in print. You can, obviously, that's a great one to be doing hands-on in person, but you can theoretically do it in all those different ways and be successful. So again, if I was looking at something like that, I would be talking about a cross-functional team. So that goes beyond just instructional design models. There's project management and all that good stuff. For my piece of it, though, I would find out, do your homework up front, find out what the problem is, and I'd just kind of start working through both ADDIE and Gagne, because those are the ones that I can do off the top of my head. If I had a little more time, I might go out and find some other things. I'm not sure I'd try and reinvent the wheel, so to speak, that cliche, which means I'm not sure I would spend a ton of time going out and researching something new and different that I hadn't seen before. I would find out perhaps from some trusted colleagues, what are you using that's very helpful, or what have you seen personally that you know that works? What has the company had success with on other projects? Questions like that can help you kind of zero in on it. But I probably wouldn't stress too much at this stage in my career with what model I was using, because I think those are some go-to ones. So I don't know if that's the kind of question you were looking for, and my answer might have been different straight out of graduate school than it is now. So.
Okay, and another question is that how would you motivate them to take the training course? Because basically they have, from the top to the bottom, they have different responsibility, background, and wages of instructional designers. How would you make sure that they would take the class? They would just watch it, video or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, so this is something I'm laughing, not because your question is funny, but this is because this is one of the challenges in the industry, in my opinion. And I think depending on the organization, there may not be a lot of tolerance for analysis. So that time that you need to spend up front learning what the problem is, learning what your audience is like, learning, all these different things, and coming up with your design, in my experience, you have to try and do that as quickly as possible, because in instructional design, that can take a third of the time of your overall development. And for that time, and sometimes for bigger projects, it can take more. And for someone who doesn't know instructional design, they're not seeing a deliverable. They're just waiting, and they don't understand what you're doing. And so to them, it looks like, oh, I'm still thinking. I'm still figuring this out. I'm still asking this question. So that's why I laugh, because you have to balance that. So there's an ideal way to do these things, and then there's a way that's not quite so ideal that sometimes you have to do. So I think my philosophy when it comes to the motivation, I do what I call stealth analysis. So what I can learn about my audience in an organization at any given time, I try to just stockpile. I try to write down everything I can find out about that group when I'm not even on a project with them, because I know when I get an assignment and I have to teach something to that group, there may not be time to find out more about them. So know that going in. If you have an organization and you're going to be training for internal folks as opposed to clients outside, keep that mental file going. Don't expect that you're always going to have time to go and do that deep dive. The other thing is, I think the best motivation for adult learners is to find the relevancy and applicability. If you can prove to them that they're going to learn something that will make their lives easier, then they're motivated. And if you can do it in a way that saves them time and saves them money and heartache, they're usually motivated. So short of doing the full-blown analysis that we don't always have time to do, that's my go-to part. So I try and spend my time on the homework up front, asking where are the biggest problem areas? Where are they struggling the most now? What's taking them the longest to do? Or I'll talk to them and say, if you could do something differently about this job, if you wish something was different, what would it be? What is the hardest part about trying to do this? And that's where I try and focus. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. I have one, the last one question. Sorry, it got too many. The last one will be, how often do you have to adapt to a new technology or skill as an instructional designer? Because basically, apparently you will have faced different challenges for different projects, but how often do you need to learn new skills?
Well, I think I think it's always good to learn. I personally like the challenge. So even if I didn't have to, I'd probably go out and kind of find different things I could be learning. I don't know. Back at Anderson, like I said, kind of started dabbling with the HTML, the cascading style sheets. Depending on the size of your group, you may have other people who are doing this. If you're in a small group, like where I'm at now, then it's a matter of what you're going to be able to do on your own. So learning things like Captivate, Camtasia, that's more important. So I think it really depends on the environment. I think where there's a will, there's a way. You guys have the knowledge in your head, or you will have that when you graduate about what makes good learning. So as long as you have kind of a set of go-to tools that you can use, then just find out about the environment. Do you have staff on hand who do technology? What are the tools they're using? Will I be able to take courses in that? Or will I have time to come up to speed on this? Are you expecting me to do that? Do I hand it off to them? Do you not want instructional designers to do that? And just kind of get a feel for that organization. I don't know that there's necessarily a hard and fast rule for what you have to learn how frequently. So I would say learn at least some of the big tools, be able to, again, scope projects so that you know that if you're prescribing a solution that's going to be very time consuming, very costly, hasn't been done before, you need to know that. You need to know just broad parameters, and you also need to know kind of how you would build it on your own. If it had to be you, what tools could you do by yourself?
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Tori, just a follow-up question. I wonder if you could tell the students, when you're dealing with professionals in a work environment, this is a problem that we kind of had to tackle here as well in how we address these various types of training scenarios. Let's say, for example, that your audience has a mixture of people that some like face-to-face training. They're very much attuned to that. Others prefer the anonymity of an online course and the self-paced nature of an online course. Others may like audio courses or things like that they can do in their car. So when you have that type of variety, how do you approach when you're designing learning? How do you approach the design process so that you can placate that variety of audiences, that variety of different?
So are we talking about learning styles?
We are, sort of.
Okay. You're not going to say like the kinesthetic learners and the visual learners and the auditory learners, or are we just talking more general preference?
Just more general. I kind of hate to go into that because it's such a very debated field right now. A lot of people feel very strongly about learning styles, but there are people who have certain preferences for how their instruction is delivered.
Yeah.
Like these students here may have elected to take this course online or face-to-face rather because they want the interaction. Others prefer to take it face-to-face. So how do you offer courses in different modes, or how do you do that?
So depending on the size of the organization and the resources available to you, that's really what it comes down to, because you don't always have the time and the budget to be able to cater to everyone. So in my experience, it's a matter of prioritizing. And to me, I think this is where the analysis, that's just the heart of the design process, in my opinion, is figuring out the right problem to solve. What is the most important piece? And so if you have audiences with different preferences, who has the biggest need? So if you look at, the whole reason that you're doing any kind of a learning intervention in the first place, what are the most critical problems that people are struggling, and what makes them critical? Is this a deal breaker? If I do this wrong, what does it cost to the company? What does it cost to that person downstream? If you don't have things that are that critical, then where are the most common mistakes and common pain points? And those are costing the company money because you're having repeated errors, rework, those kinds of things. So that's where I would suggest you make priority decisions if you can't please everybody all the time. And it might be that it's stakeholders. It might be that there's a certain group that this has to be successful with this particular audience for these reasons. And the needs might be different. It might be that you do the hands-on training with one group, and then another is just more communication because they're critical to the success of your function. And so it's just kind of I don't know that I have a hard and fast answer. I think a lot of it is about prioritization and making strategic decisions going into it. I don't know that, with these organizations I've been in, and the couple are very, very large, and I can't think of an initiative where we've done something that catered to everybody's needs or wants, I should say, because also that's another thing. I will say I experienced with the Fed, sometimes you have people coming to you and saying, I want this, and that's their preference. But it turns out if you run it, they actually get lower scores than if you do it. An instructional designer might come in and know that because of the nature of this kind of content, it's going to be best taught in this way. And you can go ahead and run it sometimes on a smaller scale, but then they have a big aha. Oh, yeah, I can see. Maybe I don't prefer online learning for this piece. And you just gotten yourself some credibility. So again, I haven't seen it a lot, and I think it's a strategic choice. I do know we were also experimenting with content management systems so that we would be able to push out the same data to different devices, different platforms to kind of help enable this. It was an expensive pursuit. I think we ended up building kind of our own content management system, but the breadth of work that we wanted it to do was so large. I just don't think that kind of custom delivery choices met the priority list. So that's been my experience with it anyway.
That's really important. You raised several important concepts there, but I just kind of want to circle back and talk about real quick. So you can't necessarily design for every audience, right? So don't try and design 5 flavors of the same learning event because that may not be very effective. You may not have the time. It may cost too much money to do something like that. So you're going to have to, through the analysis process, figure out what's going to be the best delivery model and arrive at that and deliver that based upon your knowledge and your expertise. You are the learning expert. You know what's going to work best. And you're going to be able to derive some of that from analysis of your audience. So that's really important that you don't try and design 6 flavors of the same thing because 2 guys don't like to come to face-to-face training. You can't do that. It's not efficient.
I want to add something.
Yeah. Hold on, Tori. Malik has a question.
Hi, Tori. It's not a question. I want just to add something regarding the question of about the motivation of learning or learners, how to motivate learners. I think you said something very important in corporate world. I think the scholars is always debating on how people learn in organizations or how to create ideal environment for employees to learn. I think it's based on the environment of organization itself. They classify the organization as 2 classifications. The first one is learning organization and organization, or 2 concepts, learning organization and organizational learnings. The organizational learnings defined as to construct like a structure that maximize and enhance learning in an organization. But the learning organization, which is more ideal concept, they defined it as the organization that facilitates learning to all of its members and continuously transform itself. So this environment, I think, is more creative for employees and maximize learning and ability to learn and motive to learn. That's
I would agree, and I think the trick is as you go into the industries, how do you help create that learning organization? How do you put it in place? If you're one person and they come to you and say, I need training, and you have X amount of time and you want to impress them or show a difference, how do you help do that? So something to think about. But that's an excellent point. I agree with you.
Thank you.
I appreciate all these great questions. I really enjoy this. Thank you. All right, Dr. Gibson, are there more that you wanted to cover real quick, or should we keep going, or what would you like to do from here?
Surface? Thursday? Not yet.
All right. All right. How many of you have done some consulting before or thought about it? All right. It's often a pretty...
I did consulting, but it's not in instructional design and technology. It's in different disciplines.
All right, fair enough. It's still good experience, definitely. Consulting kind of intrigues me sometimes because I think a lot of people, if they're between jobs, you can call yourself a consultant. May or may not make you a good consultant, so something to keep in mind. So the advantage is, if you are between jobs, you can go out and hunt down projects. You can, my dad owned a business, so I could have gone and done work for him. I could have gone and done work for my church. I could have done work for the Girl Scouts or those kinds of things and had some clients and been a consultant. So that might be something you can consider. I went to consulting right after I left Anderson, and at the time, if you're in the corporate world, and I'd be very sensitive to where you're doing this with the organizations, in that environment, it was sometimes called, because of the culture, the Hotel California, after the song. So we said you can check out, but you can never leave. So a lot of people left Anderson. You could go out and do consulting work. It was a way to get a wider variety of experience faster. And then you kind of get that credibility, and then you can go back. And then a lot of people would use that and kind of skip the next level for the typical promotion track. So if you went out and were a consultant for a couple years, you could come in automatically at a higher grade level because you had already had that experience. So that's how it was, again, with the bigger cities. It is very risky. I would not necessarily recommend doing that straight out of the gate, and that's part of what I wanted to share with you. When I was a consultant, I ended up doing mostly subcontract work, which means that I worked for somebody who had her own consulting business. And so it was Robin Dawn and Associates. So she could bring on people as she needed to fill the different project needs. I liked it because, and when I started consulting, I don't know that that was my intention necessarily, but she was also from Anderson and needed somebody that had the technology background that I did. And so started giving me some work. And so I thought it was great because then I didn't have to worry about marketing or billing or any of those things that come along with owning your own business. So it was very helpful that way. I was surprised to learn that most contractors, at least back then, were part-time. I guess that didn't really occur to me. I think part of that's because you can set your fees. You are your own boss. You're responsible for producing some results. And so you get to make those decisions on your own about how long it's going to take you. I will say that feast or famine there is what happened, what I saw personally with some consultants. But this one that I worked with, I was so impressed with her. I think if you you're working hard and you're adding value and you're creating those deep relationships, she ended up having basically a waiting list. I've never seen this before. I don't know how common it is, but I've not seen this before. But she basically was booking work like 6 months in advance. So I think if you're going to do it right. I learned a lot of great things. It was really fun. She was doing a lot of work for McDonald's Corporation in Chicago also. So that was very cool. There was some work that was on site, both formal and informal, and there was a fair amount of work off site. So she kind of had her own office on one of the levels in her home. I learned from her that, at least at the time, kind of the magic setup for consulting would be an instructional designer, a graphic artist, and a programmer or a web designer. So I thought that was helpful. So if you do consider it at some point, those are key skills. She did have an editor that she hired as a contractor sometimes. But I will say too, consultants in Chicago, Dr. Gibson, you mentioned United. At this time, when I started in the industry, Chicago was booming. It was one of the big places to get great instructional design jobs. While I was in Chicago, there were, I think, United either lost the hub or had massive layoffs. Sears, I think, was another one. Another big company there had the same issue. And then towards the tail end of my consulting days, I think, is when Arthur Andersen started to kind of dissolve. So in times of economic hardship, the consultants in our industry, what they were finding is if you didn't have at least 5 years experience out there, you really didn't have a chance. And even the really good consultants, like the one I worked with, she went through their entire savings to be able to get through. And now she's still consulting and is doing fine, but it was a really tough time. 9/11 also happened during that time, so most small businesses really took a hit. So again, that feast or famine, it's great with the flexibility, but if you're going to do it, really make sure that you're adding value every chance you can get. When I was in graduate school, they had a course on consulting, and it was they used that book, Peter Block's Flawless Consulting, which is still, I think, a good book to refer to. But basically, keep that consulting mentality. Every point of contact you have with somebody, think about adding value, being polished and professional. It might be the line of questioning that you're going to ask naturally as good instructional designers. That might trigger something that they didn't think about. When you're asking them about common or critical mistakes, just that alone is helpful to them sometimes. It might be the way, again, you're presenting your analysis. You're showing here's a task sequence, but here it is in visual form. That is something that they can turn around and use right away. Those are all helpful consulting skills. It might be sharing with them another resource. Hey, I saw this article. This sounds like something you could use. Any of those things. But if you're going to be in consulting, you have to always be on and always be adding value. So let me see.
Hey, Tori, about that, let me circle back that real quick. So let's say, for example, that some of these students want to go into consulting. And obviously it would take a bigger city than Emporia to do this effectively, but everybody needs training, right? I mean, it's just so important. So would you recommend that if they were starting off in the consulting world, that they develop a portfolio of some projects with some metrics regarding some of the ROI that they can achieve, and sort of shop that around to businesses or corporations to say, look, you know, if you were to invest in this training application, something similar to this, I can yield this much savings for your company over a period of time. How would you recommend sort of cold calling when it comes to that type of thing?
Well, I think so I like what you said about setting up, if you are going to go into consulting with no experience, I think you would definitely want to have a business plan and think through these things. Who would be your market? Who would you contact? How would you contact them? All those things. So I like the way you set up that example. And I would say, and to me, I think sales is really about just win-win. It's not about dollars. It's not about quotas. I think it's about helping people. And so I think if you have a solution that you feel like is really going to help them, then I don't think it's as hard to do the cold calls. And it might be that you're going to these conferences where your type of client exists. It might be meeting them, you know, having an open house where you're at a local coffee shop and you're inviting them to, you know, you're buying coffee or those kinds of things for them. Just try and think about different ways. These are just arbitrary examples. I'm not necessarily recommending them, but I'm just trying to say, try to find ways that you bump into these people or are able to have some natural connections anyway. learn as much about them as you can. You can do informational interviews. You can say, I'm developing this type of approach. I think it could help a company like yours. I'd love to get some feedback on it. I haven't brought it to market yet. Would you mind if I might, you might help me test this? If I could learn some things about your organization, could you give me a tour? Could you tell me some of the things you're wrestling with? I'm creating my business plan. I'd love your input. Those kinds of things, just different ways to try and get in there and start that conversation. But again, I think if you're in it just to earn money, to meet quotas or those kinds of things, sooner or later, I think people figure that out. If you're in there legitimately because you think you can help them, I think that's what people are looking for. But again, that's my bias. So is that helpful?
Yes, it is. Great advice. I did some consulting myself for quite a while. It is tough because sometimes training is one of those areas that a lot of companies, when they're looking to cut or to reach margins, whatever the case might be, fortunately or not, training is oftentimes one of the first things that goes, right?
Yep.
They cut that area first. And so, if a company is struggling, that's not an area that they're going to typically invest a lot of money in. So it's one of those things, I think it's a challenge to try and convince a company that training can actually, I think, improve their bottom line. But you're going to have to obviously have some data to be able to prove that.
Yeah, and the best thing is to not have to do the cold calling. So I think that's where some of the, I hate to keep using that term networking, and I really don't even like the term, but I think it has to do with building those meaningful relationships. So with people you work with, get out there and find, is there such thing as a mecca of ID right now? If so, where is that? Where are there large concentrations of people doing what you do or you want to do? And how can you go and meet some of them and get excited and learn what they're doing and share ideas and just build things and think about it? Or how can you talk to them or, establish those peer groups and find some of those companies, because then you have some natural connections to start going down this path. If not, it's a little bit harder. So
thanks.
But so this next one kind of touches on what we were talking about. This last phrase, people buy from people buy from people they like. That's a quote I still remember from graduate school, and that professor that taught the consulting class, and that was his whole point. And sooner or later, you're going to be found out if you're not in it just to help them. So anyway, for what it's worth, I incidentally got that from consulting. I got my job at the Fed. I guess it's an illustration of this. It's an example. I had a colleague from graduate school. I went to the client services group in Anderson and had left. And then she had an MBA and did some other things. And then she went to Anderson right when I was leaving, or maybe it was even after. But we kind of had stayed in touch. We're from the same graduate program. And I was consulting. And she left me a voicemail. We were kind of missing each other, but she didn't say what she needed. And as a consultant, I worked certain hours, but not all the time. And at the time I had young kids. Well, I happened to get a random phone call from the director of the Center for Online Learning, and I wasn't expecting it. And it turns out that my colleague had been asking me to give her a reference, and I didn't know it. So I got the phone call unexpectedly. And was able to share some information. But at the end of the phone call, she basically said, well, we have 2 positions open. Are you interested in one? And I just still think that's funny, because not only did I not expect the phone call, but in the middle of it, my girls, I think they were about 3 at the time, came up and made some kind of noise and mom, something. And so I just kind of laughed and said, I'm sorry, I guess if I'm not barricaded in my home office, I'm fair game. And I was in my head thinking, oh, I just blew this. I'm so sorry, Melanie. I didn't know this was coming. But it turned out that the director, she appreciated that. So she had kids. She worked from home. And I guess she thought, balance of work and life. So I guess you just never know. So again, you have to be yourself, help people, be as professional as possible, and just build those relationships. So anyway, again, I thought that might be kind of an example of how those things work themselves out sometimes. Okay, so the Fed is my most recent experience prior to coming to Keiko ISOM. I worked there for 12 years. It was a great experience. when we started the Center for Online Learning at the time, I think there were about 5 people. It was a chance to go in, having come from that great big company and then being a consultant. We had some people with different backgrounds who were starting this group, but I was very excited because as consultants, sometimes you go in, you do something, and then you walk away. So while you may have more credibility than internal staff at times, you're not always able to see the results and see it roll out. And they're just, you get to be brought in only for that piece they hire you in, unless you negotiate also otherwise. And sometimes it's nice to be able to get to stay and see what happens and get to know all the people and all that good stuff. And then just to have some responsibility. And like I said, I like some of that entrepreneurial piece of it. So this was a great chance. A lot of blood, sweat, and tears, a lot of hours. Getting that put together. There were a lot of times where we were just kind of out there getting our name out, so doing a lot of presentations, being very selective about what projects we take on. And that, to the question earlier about kind of the preferences and how you would approach like a worldwide rollout, being with the Fed at that point, I think really helped kind of refine the way I look at that. You have to think about, again, some of that's that common sense, that cost benefit, just your common sense gut check thinking about it. But online projects, you had people coming in saying, I have something that I think would be really cool. It's a 20-slide PowerPoint, and I want to send this to everybody. At the time, those kind of projects would not make the cut. What we were looking at were projects that had a system impact, so meaning all the reserve banks across the nation. And just random trivia, does anyone know how many reserve banks there are?
Oh, man, that's a great question. Can I guess? Would I be silly if I guess?
One guess is 7?
7? I was going to say 20, but I don't know.
Or 13.
13? 13? I don't know.
All right, 13 is the closest. Yes, that's correct. Actually, there are 12 plus the Board of Governors, so that makes 13. So they're all across the country, and then some of those have branch locations, so it could go up if you consider the branches. But in terms of the districts and the presidents who rotate on the voting membership, there's 12 plus the Board of Governors. So if I was in the room, I'd throw you candy right now. So good job on that.
I work at a bank, so I kind of cheated.
Ah, okay, got it. You did answer that really quickly, so makes sense. When I worked with the Fed, when I worked with Anderson, it was bigger than the Fed, but I didn't travel. Everybody came to us. When I worked with the Fed, we were based in St. Louis, but we served the system nationally, so I did travel. So I've actually been to all the reserve banks but Boston and a lot of the branches. So that job had some of the cool factor too, just to be able to learn a little bit about the history and some of the inside things, and just it was pretty neat. The interview process for the Fed was a little bit different, fairly standard still at the time. I did a phone interview, and then I came in to meet the team and had to do a presentation to show a project that I was particularly either proud of or that would show the range of my skills. After that time, when our team started to grow larger, they had a fairly in-depth assessment, and I think that might be something that you all encounter quite a bit. So be prepared, and it's the other job that I was pursuing when I went to Anderson, they also did that. So you show up, they may or may not tell you in advance. They give you some materials, and they close you in a room for 2 hours, and they see what you can produce off the top of your head. The assessment at the Fed was, they tell you it's coming. I think you have 24 hours or maybe 12. Again, they give you some content, and you have to email it back, and it has to be within a certain amount of time. So that's getting pretty common. So be prepared, be ready to be able to present, be comfortable to be able to talk through why you added value, how you added value, what your design rationale was. In some cases, when you get some experience, you're not always able to share information because it's proprietary. So think through how you might want to share that information or present it. You might be just kind of conceptually sharing without having screen images or that kind of thing, but that's going to be important to you as well.
So Tori, I'm kind of curious, you may be going to get to this, but let me just throw it in here. But the Federal Reserve is not a place you typically think of as being an enclave for online learning. What types of things were they training on exactly?
I'm glad you asked, because actually there was a pretty wide variety. Our group actually started in the banking supervision area. So that's the unit that oversees all the bank examiners, one of the major functions of the Fed. So even after we expanded system-wide, that was probably 50% of our work was training the bank examiners. And one of the last major projects before I left was repurposing their curriculum. So to become a bank examiner now, does everybody have a concept of what a bank examiner is if I say that job title?
I think Darcy does.
You know, but okay. So part of the Fed's job, they are a bank, they are the nation's central bank. So they are a bank to other banks. And part of what they do is they send people out to make sure that other banks are sound, that they're not going to go under. And they also check for compliance with the laws. So bank examiners, depending on the type, because you can have a specialty area, will go in and review all the books. They'll review, you know, all kinds of things. And if they're good, we'll recommend practices or perhaps try and kind of help bolster that. But legally, they're able to say basically if you make the grade or not. And that's kind of what the job is. It's a very broad job, has a lot of different requirements. In the time I was there, it was so frustrating as an instructional designer because it's not like they give you a job description. This job is so huge. They have 2 or 3 bank exam manuals, and they are about that thick, probably 800 pages, and they read like an encyclopedia. It's terrible. You would not have time to sit down and read through it. So part of what we did, under the current commissioning process, they have to go through all these different courses, take a couple tests before they become official. It was probably 700 or 800 hours. It takes them 2 to 5 years usually to be able to do this. We worked with them as the center and created a new process to redesign their curriculum in a way that was more instructionally sound. So it was really cool, but it was massive. And they converted these 700 or 800 hours of content using the process we recommended, but they have like 25 people who are dedicated to doing this. Just the analysis alone and documenting these jobs was massive. And it's taking them 3 or 4 years or 5 years to roll out, which is incredibly aggressive considering the amount of work they're doing. So that was a big piece of the work that we did. As part of that, we also worked with the CFPB, so the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was very cool. Because they were kind of just starting up. They didn't have a large training staff, and a lot of our people actually went to work with them. So a lot there. We sometimes would work with our customers' customers. So one of my first projects with the Fed was bank director training, because the Fed argued that if you had educated bank directors, you know, they're in the trenches every day overseeing these banks. And if we could help them learn to do a better job, it would make our examiners' jobs easier. So we worked for them. So those are some that you might think are more typical to the Fed, but we also did things for law enforcement. Everybody fought for those projects because those were really cool. We did training for cash in some of their operations. We did some training for information security in some of our IT groups. We did economic education, which was also a cool one, because that was one of the initiatives in the Fed. Was there are a lot of courses out there and online learning for different grade levels, kindergarten all the way up through college. And so we worked with them to help kind of create some instructionally sound interactions and courseware and that kind of thing. So actually it was a wide variety, more than you would think. So
it sounds to me like, since you're dealing with the Fed in this particular case, that you have to adhere to, it's very prescriptive in terms of how the content is designed and delivered, right? Because you have to have certain security measures in place, and you have to prescribe to anything that's government related. Typically has processes and procedures. Can you explain a bit about that?
Yeah, so great point of conversation here. I would say we had some latitude in the way we designed and delivered, but we had to build in a legal review of almost everything. And we had to, if it was outside of the Fed, or if it was for the Board of Governors, because they are technically government. The actual districts are not, except for the president of each one. Another random piece of trivia for you. But if you're creating government courseware, it has to be ADA compliant. So the Americans with Disabilities Act. So if you put it online, it needs to be readable by like a screen reader. So you have to tag everything. It greatly affects if you're doing a flash interaction, or if you're using video, you have to transcribe it, all those kinds of things. And that can be time consuming. So there are just some things that, again, it's a lot like the technology question that you asked earlier. You have to know enough to be dangerous so that when you are recommending solutions, you have a good idea of the scope of what you're recommending. Is this going to be huge? Is this something that's never been done before? Is this problematic? Or am I recommending something that we've done a million times that is the easiest way to do it, and all that kind of thing? So obviously the first time you go into this, you're probably not going to know everything, but expect that going in. And it's just like all the other types of analysis. You need to learn about the technology and the other constraints. You need to talk to some of those users and those stakeholders and find out, some of those other models. I'll take it in this direction. Agile, successive approximation, rapid prototyping. I think what a lot of those have in common is this idea of iterative design. So you're starting with something small and you're getting feedback and you're making adjustments. When you're going into an environment, you don't know what the gotchas are. So when we were doing some of this, again, we learned to ask up front, does this need a legal review? Does this have to be reviewed by the Board of Governors? Does this have to be ADA compliant? All those things. Information security. Typically, the stuff that was delivered internally was behind the firewall and all the rest of the Fed's security. So there were other protocols within the Federal Reserve System that dictated how that would work. If it became something on a public website, the Fed, just like a lot of other organizations, was starting to deal more with some of different information security issues. And I'll tell you, I had some very interesting conversations during my last couple years about some fairly innocuous information that was out there in training, but happened to be, if you're sitting on the same server as other information, or if there's anything at all about software, for example, or those kinds of things, it's a whole different ballgame. And so, yeah, it was, and that actually was part of the reason I liked it so much, was being on these broad cross-functional teams. Again, with Anderson, it was huge, but I was working with a lot of learning professionals, different facets of instructional design. When I was with the Fed, also a very large organization, but working with people with different backgrounds. So working with IT people, information security specialists. There's a difference, by the way, between a web programmer and a web designer. So I got to work with both. Very cool. Working with editors and graphic artists and subject matter experts and writers, all kinds of things. So I liked the diversity there. I was able to learn lots of things, but I think it's very hard to navigate all that stuff on your own, and there's a learning curve. So I don't know. That's my long-winded answer there, but yes, is the short answer to that. Yes, there was a lot to consider.
So class, be aware of, we'll get to this segment later, it's in another module, but you'll be introduced to universal design for one UDL. And it's a very important concept. So if you're ever doing any sort of contractual work for any federal or state, local government, there's overarching laws in place in terms of how you deliver and design content. And it has to include ADA accessibility. So you can't skimp on things like subtitling for videos, as she mentioned, offering things in a variety of sort of text reader friendly sort of thing. JAWS is a screen reader for various types of things. It has to be JAWS compliant. Section 508, all of those things are considerations. Your product will not pass muster if it doesn't meet Section 508 compliancy. So it's just important. It's an important consideration, different than the corporate sector.
And I think too, that's why, for me personally, I enjoyed working for an organization first before going consulting, just to get a feel for kind of some of these different industries and for some of you, if you're already working in organizations now where you might be doing instructional design work later, and you have an inside advantage, or you might be going to a similar company. But there's a lot to take in. I don't want it to sound overwhelming. There's certainly ways to go in and kind of get your feet wet like there is for anything else. But you learn as you go, and obviously the more experience you get, the better you get. So let's see. I did mention, I think before, some of that consulting approach. In the Fed, I'll talk about this collaboration there. I don't know if you guys kind of caught our own homemade jargon. As I said, the center was based in the St. Louis Fed, but was a national organization. Having said that, there are not always offices in the Fed that are officially sanctioned as the only provider. So we did online learning and we did instructional design, but to a certain extent, we had competitors inside the system, which is interesting. After you get to a certain size, we again started out in banking supervision, so we were part of the same group that the bank examiners work in. And so that funded some of our initial online learning, big pieces, because they were our audience. As we started to grow, there are different cost models like there are in any organization, and there were actual funds exchanged from district to district when we did a project. So we were chargeable. So again, we had internal competition. The Fed, in my unofficial opinion, and they groom you very carefully when you're inside. When you give any presentation, you have to share that these are my opinions, not the official opinion of the Fed. So I'm going to say that again. You're always vulnerable to, I guess I'll call it reorganizing. So just like, I don't know if you're familiar with the Fed at all, but they have cash operations, or they did check processing. So we were the banker's bank. So at the end of the day, if you were a Federal Reserve member, if you were a bank, and you made your deposit and you had excess cash that you didn't want stored in your vault, well, guess where it would go? It would go to the Federal Reserve, and it would get counted in their big cash processing machines and stored in their vault. That was a job, and that was located bigger centers, smaller centers in different places across the country. As people started using less checks, for example, Check 21 was a law that passed, I don't know, 5 years ago, probably maybe more than that, but that changed the way checks are written, because you could use an electronic image to clear the check. You didn't have to send it somewhere to be processed and sent to the other bank before it would withdraw the funds. That impacted the number of people that you needed to process these checks. And as these things changed, then the Fed starts to look at where all those operations reside and the volume at every location. And then they have to make decisions, not unlike other organizations, about how do we do this in the most cost-efficient manner. And so you are always at risk internally of being absorbed or relocated or those kinds of things. And so that collaboration was us working with other pockets in the system that did what we do, instructional design, but also thinking about how we add value. And our group was one of the biggest, so how do we make sure that what we're doing makes sense and that we're kind of playing an umbrella role, or that we're, and so it was an interesting mix to be internal but still have to be competitive, and to be, I loved the challenge of, working with other units and trying to help them in any way you can, but at the same time thinking about how you're adding value and that your group is going to make sense. So I thought that was very interesting there. So again, I don't know if that might be a government thing. Some of that is not unique, though, to a government organization, just that awareness of your overhead and the value that you add. So while I was there, again, our team grew from just that startup to be pretty darn big. Lots of opportunities to do really cool things, travel, leadership opportunities. Lots and lots of communication was required. Good, strong communication skills, whether from written, phone, doing presentations as we were building the business, as we were serving our clients. But again, that technology piece was huge. especially being online learning. But again, because we were essentially a national organization, most of our customers were somewhere else. So it wasn't uncommon for any designer in that group to be on the phone with New York or Washington, D.C. or San Francisco or, all these things. So you were doing a lot of that work nationally, and you had subject matter experts, lots of different locations. One of my projects in the first probably 2 or 3 years was coordinating 60 different SMEs across the country to write their piece of this giant online course. So you learn really quickly how to use and get comfortable with instant messaging or the web conferencing or all those different things. And that's where you can add value too, because you're dealing with subject matter experts who hear that there's a new toy but don't know how to use it. And that's something that, again, I think that technology piece adds additional credibility to what we do, and it helps you build that relationship so that you start talking to them. It might start with, oh yeah, here's how you can do a screen capture, or here's how you can share your screen, here's how you can annotate on screen, here's how you record it, any number of things. But then you're getting credibility. And so then when you start talking about, well, here's your content for that bank director training, I'll use as an example. The SME I was working with there actually wrote a book about this, and he'd traveled nationally and put on these little workshops, and he'd go to different banks and he'd have these live in-person presentations, and it was successful, and it was he was very careful about it. And part of what I did as an instructional designer was basically go in and surgically remove some of the content and rearrange it to these little bite-sized morsels that could be served up online. And that was very scary for him, but because we had some of that relationship, and I was able to kind of share with him some other things along the way in terms of learning technology and that kind of stuff, he was able to kind of extend a little bit of faith as we go through. And so in the end, I was able to gain his trust, and we did something much bigger and better probably than we had before. So anyway, just some neat things. Also about managing a team, managing remotely, learning the technology. As I've advanced in my career, I think it's become less about instructional design per se on a small scale and more about like curriculum design. And like I said, one of those big projects when I left was curriculum redesign. So for the 700 or 800 hours of that certification, basically, what does it look like if we do it all over again from an instructional perspective, make it more instructionally sound. So as I've advanced in my career, I think you just kind of get a higher level view. And part of what I like about the job that I'm doing now is that it's kind of a mix of both. There's some of the curriculum view, but it's a small group. They don't have another instructional designer here. So the part of the challenge I work on is, go to the next one here, if I can navigate okay. Is part of what I'm doing is trying to balance and really test my prioritization skills so that I can try and be strategic and think about that curriculum level view, but at the same time help be the hands that they need and get the work done. So I think something that I've noticed too over time is that when you're building a business and you're with a startup group, both companies, in fact, all the companies I've worked with, and you'll hear it a lot, are say innovation is very important. We are experimenting. We did at the Fed. We're doing somewhat here with new tools, somewhat new processes, new backgrounds, these kinds of things. But I think what really makes a difference from what I've seen between creating a thriving environment like we had at Anderson with that learning organization, as you pointed out earlier, and just having innovation for the sake of change or where it feels scary to people or it causes pressure, I think has to do with the management culture. So think about that. When I was talking about fit before, think about if these are people you'd want to work with, people that you trust and respect, people that have a long-term vision for not only your group, but how your group contributes to the wider organization. Are they making decisions for a reason, or are they just doing it for their preference? And I think if they're doing it for a reason and they want to go a certain place, that's where it becomes more invigorating and can be exciting. And if they're kind of doing it for random change, well, you better make sure that you enjoy the same kinds of things that they enjoy because they're doing it around their preferences. So just a little something that I've noticed. Here at Keiko ISOM, again, I've talked about kind of the size being different. Their culture is fantastic. That was one of the big things. I've been with these big organizations. Keiko ISOM is only about probably a little less than 400 people. It is national, and I think it's growing. On a practical level, I have less travel. There's a smaller team. I like the challenge of being able to make a difference. But again, I like that I have to stay on top of my game. You never quite know what's going to hit you that day. Some things I haven't had to deal with in a long time. A lot of informational pieces that they're asking us to do that aren't training per se. And so I go back to that again. Part of our value is how we present the content. The other half is how we teach it. So not just helping or assisting them with some of that informational delivery, but we're moving now. I'm trying to move the group more towards kind of a business line view. So in terms of the groups that we serve, having conversations now about what is the highest, most important goal that they have for this year and how we can assist with that. And then being able to use that to make priority decisions about the work we're doing. So that way we're not reacting, we're being a little more proactive. And again, thinking about the consulting skills, becoming business partners, and those kinds of things. It's about getting to know your customer, what you can do to add value. So we're kind of working through that. So another exciting thing I think that's here is that they have full-time talent advisors. So again, it's not unlike what I mentioned at Anderson with the professional development manager, but here talent advisors are part of the people team, so they may not be accountants, but it is their full-time job to help groom people. So they're kind of separating the technical expertise and just that development. So I think that's really cool. Trying to think. Had some questions in here, but we covered quite a few of them already.
Tori, can you unbundle that a bit? What do you mean talent development? Are you talking about personal development or professional development? What does that mean?
Yeah, both. So what it means now is, okay, here's something else that you guys will experience if you haven't seen it firsthand already. In organizations, it's not uncommon for people to get promoted because they're great at their jobs. When you get promoted and you're great at your job, it doesn't guarantee that you're going to be a great manager or a great instructor. And so that being the case, managers and instructors need additional assistance, and you could help them with that. But their employees and their students also need assistance sometimes. And the model here is to create talent advisors so that the people that are moving up in the organization have a little more time to be client facing. And we are offering specialists who can come in and help coach and supervise employees using kind of a human performance technology model. We have one person on staff here who's actually getting a master's in organizational improvement, I think. I was stunned. She doesn't come from training, but she knew what HPT was, so that's exciting. But they're working on, they just started around the same time that I did, so they're creating a new model about what this looks like and how to kind of split that technical expertise and development with somebody who comes in and helps just foster and grow their professional track. So does that answer that?
It sure does, thank you.
It's a really, really neat initiative. I'm very excited to be here when this is happening. And then the merger piece is a whole different animal. Kennedy & Co., when I joined, was a little bit less than 200 people, and then they merged with a company in California about the same size. So getting to be in the conversation and help to plan, how do you bring those two together? What training does everybody need? What changes are there going to be? How do you, in terms of delivery, how do you change delivery? All those things. So it's been pretty exciting that way. So anyway, let me just stop and see what other questions you have. I know I've been yakking a long time. There's a whole lot of information here. So I hope there were some things in here that you found useful.
I've got a question about the merger. If I could sort of tickle that for just a second. When you brought two different companies together with, I suppose you had two different training and professional development, human performance sort of backgrounds and maybe philosophies. How were you able to blend those two together, sort of synchronize those two different cultures and environments?
Well, that's a very good question. When I was initially talking with them here, my biggest concern was, because again, we're talking about the line versus staff. This is a staff position. In my whole career, this is other than just that one short part of a year at Anderson, this is the first time I've been in a staff position. And so with mergers and acquisitions, I was worried about us being let go if we did merge with another company that had a learning function, and what does that look like? Here, I think we have acquired other companies, but they've generally been smaller, and they basically, when it's an acquisition, they just say, you're basically going to become part of us, do everything the way we do, and then generally it would be the smaller company just is under the umbrella of whatever's in place. So learning would be whatever's in place for us is what they're going to be doing. It's kind of a non-issue. In this case with the merger, they were very thoughtful, I think, about finding an organization that shared our culture. And I think that made a difference. On their side, they did not have the same kind of training that we had. They basically have technical information that they would share and a lot of just on the job. On our side, we have a standing curriculum, and it's fairly hands-on and interactive. So that was a very nice blend that way. We didn't have to make a lot of tough decisions. They didn't have full-time training staff on their side. So it's been kind of a non-issue, and that was definitely something I asked about when I came in. I don't know that they're, who knows, you never say never, but I don't know that we'll be doing something this big from what I've observed for a little while again, but again, never say never, and that is something that's a possibility. When I asked my boss, she's the head of people for the entire organization. She reports directly to the CEO. So again, when I gave up, I'm coming in as staff. I'm not chargeable, but I am very high in the organization, you know, just 2 layers below the CEO. So again, thinking about those things as you go in, what she was able to tell me is that our CEO is very committed to the people strategy here. Their mission has people in it. So she basically felt like training was never going to go away because it was a very critical part of the organization. So again, I can't guarantee that there won't be difficult conversations in the future, but that being part of their culture and the way that I see that they make decisions, I feel reasonably confident that, you know, it will work out and they will keep everyone's best interest at heart. So, tough question.
Other questions? No? Something's on your mind. Come on, then.
I have a question.
You have a question? Oh, I thought you did. Mohammed? Wait, you have any more questions? Strap? Yep. Person? Well, that was just a wealth of information, Tori. That was just incredible. And what a great background that you have. It's just so refreshing to talk to somebody that's been in such a diverse set of experiences and background. We just don't encounter people like that all the time, who really immerse themselves in the corporate instructional design process. So that was just really, really good.
I would urge your students, now that you guys are kind of the guinea pigs for this, to be thinking about, you know, what would be most helpful. When I was in graduate school, we were able to go visit a couple different companies, or, you know, and at the Fed, we hosted student visits. So I think my intent today was to kind of do a whirlwind tour, if you will, of a couple different organizations and kind of compare and contrast. So I would urge you all to be thinking about what would be useful for future students, whether that's me or anybody else coming in. What's, you know, is it a site visit? Is it just hearing about one organization? Is it hearing about not necessarily what it was like, but just hearing the challenges between types of organizations? Or just think, now that you've kind of sat through this, how you would divide it up differently to be more effective or more helpful. So I just challenge you guys to share that with Dr. Gibson for future classes.
Well, Tori, thank you so much. You've been very gracious with your time. We thank you so much for taking this evening out, really, to spend some time with the students. I hope it was okay that I recorded this. Is that still okay with you?
Sure.
Okay, great. Because there was a couple of people that I'm sure want to see this, so that's great. So I'll be touching base with you offline, so to catch up with you. And we do thank you so much for everything and all your time tonight.
Sure. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate you letting me talk your ear off and getting some information. So good luck to all of you. And if you have projects, again, that you need a corporate customer, then please call me.
Yeah, we will. We will definitely be reaching out to you for sure. So.
All right.
Okay. Thanks, Tori.
All right. Bye-bye.
Let's see here. Let me stop the recording.